The rain fell in steady sheets, drenching the city in a rhythmic hum that seemed to drown out the noise of honking cabs, chattering pedestrians, and the distant wail of sirens. It was late, nearly midnight, and most people hurried along the slick sidewalks, eager to escape the downpour and retreat into the warmth of their homes. But Keanu Reeves wasn't most people. Dressed in a dark wool coat, hands tucked into his pockets, he moved through the streets with the kind of unhurried ease that came from years of solitude. He had always loved the rain. There was something poetic about the way it softened the sharp edges of the world, how it masked the sorrows of those who walked beneath it. Tonight, however, something felt different. It was a feeling he couldn't quite place, like a whisper of fate tugging at the edges of his consciousness. He had just stepped off the curb at a quiet intersection when he saw her. She stood beneath a flickering street lamp, her figure barely visible through the curtain of rain. Her coat was thin, completely soaked, clinging to her slender frame as if it had become a part of her. Long, dark hair stuck to her cheeks, her head tilted downward, as if she were lost in a world no one else could see. Keanu slowed his pace, instinctively drawn to the stillness surrounding her. In a city where everyone was always moving, always rushing, she was a statue against the storm. Something about her posture sent a quiet ache through his chest. She wasn't just standing in the rain. She was surrendering to it. For a moment, he hesitated. He had always been careful about intruding on people's space, especially strangers. But something in the pit of his stomach told him that if he walked away now, he would regret it. So he stepped closer. "Miss." His voice was low but gentle, carrying through the rain with surprising clarity. She didn't move at first. But then, slowly, her head lifted, and their eyes met. Keanu's breath caught in his throat. Her eyes, deep, haunting, yet achingly familiar, held a kind of pain that went beyond the moment, beyond the rain. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, who had fought battles in silence, who had grown accustomed to the weight of invisible burdens. He had seen those eyes before. Not hers, exactly, but in others. In himself. She parted her lips as if to speak, but the words didn't come immediately. Instead, she just looked at him, as though trying to decide whether he was real or just another ghost passing her by. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke 3 words. "You came back." Keanu felt something shift inside him, something he couldn't name. The words weren't just words. They carried history, meaning, something he didn't understand yet, but could feel with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Confusion flickered across his face, but he didn't look away. "Do I know you?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost afraid of the answer. A sad, almost knowing smile touched the corners of her lips. "No," she murmured, "but I know you." The air between them felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. The rain continued to fall, indifferent to the moment unfolding beneath it. Keanu didn't know what to say. He had met thousands of people throughout his life, had countless encounters with strangers who claimed to know him, who wanted something from him. But this was different. She wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't even trying to explain herself. She was simply there, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. A gust of wind swept through the street, making her shiver. Instinctively, Keanu shrugged off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. She looked up at him, startled by the gesture, as if kindness was something she hadn't expected. "You shouldn't be out here," he said softly. "You'll catch a cold." For a long moment, she just stood there, gripping the edges of his coat as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored to reality. Then, with a quiet exhale, she nodded. "Come on," Keanu said, motioning toward a nearby cafe that still had its lights on. "Let's get you somewhere warm." She hesitated, glancing down the street as if considering whether to run or follow. But in the end, she took a slow step forward, then another. Keanu didn't press her for answers. Not yet. But something told him this wasn't a chance meeting. And as they walked side by side toward the dim glow of the cafe, He couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into a story far bigger than himself. The small cafe was a beacon of warmth against the cold, rain-soaked streets. Its neon open sign buzzed faintly in the window, casting a pinkish glow onto the puddles outside. Inside, the faint hum of a jazz tune mingled with the soft clinking of dishes and the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. The place was nearly empty, save for a lone barista wiping down the counter and an elderly man hunched over a newspaper in the corner. Keanu pushed the door open, the tiny bell overhead chiming softly, and held it for the woman as she stepped inside. She moved cautiously, like someone who wasn't used to being invited into warm places. Her eyes darted around, taking in every detail as if committing the scene to memory, unsure if she'd ever find herself in such a space again. Without a word, Keanu guided her to a booth near the back, away from the windows where the rain continued to drum a steady beat against the glass. The vinyl seats squeaked slightly as they settled in, the worn-out cushions familiar and oddly comforting. A young waiter approached, his eyes widening slightly as he recognized Keanu, but he quickly masked his surprise with professional politeness. "Can I get you folks anything?" Keanu glanced at the woman across from him. Her hair was still damp, dark strands clinging to her cheeks. She didn't meet his gaze. Instead, she stared down at her hands, fidgeting with the frayed edges of his coat that was still wrapped around her shoulders. "Hot chocolate," Keanu suggested gently, breaking the silence. For a moment, she didn't respond. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. "And a coffee for me," Keanu added, handing the menus back without even looking at them. The waiter left, and the cafe settled into a quiet lull once more. Keanu watched the woman, studying the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers trembled ever so slightly. She was a mystery wrapped in layers of silence, and while he had no idea who she was or why she had whispered those strange words to him, he felt a pull, an unexplainable need to understand, to help. Finally, he spoke. "What's your name?" She hesitated, as if even that simple question was too heavy to answer. But then, in a voice so soft it barely crossed the table, she whispered, "Emily." Keanu nodded, letting her take the lead, not wanting to push her into a story she wasn't ready to tell. He had learned the value of patience over the years, the importance of letting people unfold in their own time. The waiter returned with their drinks, placing a steaming mug of hot chocolate in front of Emily. The whipped cream melted slightly under the heat, and a small swirl of cocoa rose into the air. She wrapped her hands around the cup, drawing warmth from it as if it were the first real comfort she'd had in a long time. Minutes passed in silence. Keanu sipped his coffee, his eyes never leaving her face. She was young, but her eyes told a story far older than her years. Finally, Emily broke the quiet, her voice trembling. "I wasn't supposed to be here." Keanu set his cup down gently, giving her his full attention. "What do you mean?" Emily's gaze stayed fixed on the swirling contents of her mug, as if the answers lay somewhere in the chocolate depths. I didn't have anywhere else to go tonight. I was just walking, trying to forget when I saw you. And I thought," she trailed off, her voice faltering. Keanu leaned in slightly, his tone soft but steady. "You thought what?" She finally lifted her eyes to meet his, and in them, he saw a mixture of fear, hope, and disbelief. "I thought maybe it was a sign. That if I saw you, you of all people, maybe it meant things could get better." Keanu felt a lump rise in his throat. He wasn't used to people seeing him as anything more than an actor, a public figure, someone on a screen. But this wasn't about fame or movies. This was something deeper. "Why me?" he asked quietly. Emily's lips curved into a sad, almost ironic smile. "Because you're you. You've been through things. Everyone knows that. You lost people, faced tragedies, but you never gave up. You kept going. And She paused, swallowing hard. "I don't know how to do that." The weight of her words settled heavily between them. Keanu felt it in his chest, the raw vulnerability she laid bare on the table. He understood that kind of pain, the kind that gnaws at you in the quiet moments, the kind that makes you wonder if you'll ever feel whole again. He reached across the table, his hand resting gently on hers. She flinched slightly at first, but then relaxed under his touch, as if the simple human connection was enough to steady her for a moment. "You don't have to know how right now," he said softly. "You just have to take the next step. That's all. One step at a time." Emily's eyes welled with tears, but she blinked them back, her grip tightening around his hand. "But what if I can't?" Keanu's voice was steady, filled with a quiet conviction. "Then I'll walk with you until you can." For the first time since they met, Emily let out a breath that sounded like the beginning of relief. Not complete, not yet, but a start. The rain outside continued to fall, but inside that small cafe, a fragile hope began to take root. They sat there for hours, long after their drinks had gone cold, talking about nothing and everything. Keanu didn't pry into the details of her past, and Emily didn't offer them. Instead, they spoke of simple things: the weather, the books they loved, the quiet corners of the city where you could escape the noise. And in those small, ordinary moments, something extraordinary happened. Emily began to believe, even if just a little, that maybe life wasn't done with her yet. When the cafe finally closed, Keanu stood and offered her his hand once more. She took it without hesitation this time, and together, they stepped back into the rain. But it felt different now. The storm was no longer something to endure. It was something they were walking through, together. And as they disappeared into the night, neither of them knew exactly where the road would lead. But for the first time in a long time, Emily felt like maybe, just maybe, she was heading somewhere worth going. The following morning, the city awoke under a blanket of lingering mist, the rain from the night before leaving the streets slick and glistening under the pale, hesitant sunlight. Keanu had barely slept. His mind replayed the events of the night like a film reel stuck on repeat, each frame filled with Emily's hollow eyes, her whispered words, and the silent plea for help she didn't even know she had made. It wasn't the first time he'd met someone struggling, but there was something different about her, something that wouldn't let him just walk away. Keanu wasn't a stranger to pain. His life had been a mosaic of loss and perseverance, stitched together by moments of quiet resilience. But he had learned to find meaning in small acts of kindness, in being there for others even when no one had been there for him. And now he felt that familiar pull, an unspoken obligation to be a light in someone else's darkness. By mid-morning, Keanu found himself standing outside the small women's shelter he had contacted earlier. The modest brick building was tucked between two larger structures, almost as if it were trying to hide from the world. Its exterior was unassuming, but inside, it held the promise of safety and a fresh start for women like Emily. He glanced at his watch, realizing Emily would be arriving soon. After they left the cafe the night before, she had agreed to meet him here the next day, though her voice had wavered with uncertainty. Keanu knew the decision hadn't been easy for her. Trust was a fragile thing, especially for someone who had been let down more times than they could count. Minutes ticked by, and doubt began to creep into his thoughts. What if she didn't show? What if the fear was too overwhelming? Just as he was about to pull out his phone to call the shelter coordinator, he saw her. Emily approached from down the street, her steps slow and tentative. She still wore his coat from the night before, the fabric too large for her frame, but offering a small sense of security. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and though her eyes still held traces of exhaustion, there was a faint spark of determination beneath the surface. When she reached him, they stood in silence for a moment. Keanu could see the hesitation in her eyes, the internal battle waging between hope and fear. "I wasn't sure if I'd come," she admitted quietly, her voice barely above the hum of passing traffic. "I wasn't sure if you would either," Keanu replied with a gentle smile. "But I'm glad you did." They entered the shelter together, the warmth of the building enveloping them as they stepped inside. The lobby was simple but inviting, with soft chairs and colorful posters on the walls promoting support groups and counseling services. A woman with kind eyes and a welcoming smile approached them, introducing herself as Sarah, the shelter's coordinator. Keanu stayed by Emily's side as Sarah explained the shelter's services: temporary housing, counseling, job placement assistance. Emily listened quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. When Sarah mentioned the art therapy sessions offered twice a week, Keanu saw a flicker of interest in Emily's eyes. It was a small reaction, but it was enough to give him hope. After the meeting, Keanu walked Emily to the room she'd be staying in, a small but cozy space with a twin bed, a wooden dresser, and a window that overlooked a small garden in the back. Emily stood at the doorway, staring at the room as if it were an alien world she wasn't sure she belonged in. "This is a lot," she whispered, her voice tinged with disbelief. "You deserve this," Keanu said softly. "A safe place, a fresh start." Emily turned to look at him, her eyes shining with unspoken gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Keanu replied. "Just take care of yourself. That's enough." He didn't stay long after that. He knew Emily needed space to process everything, to settle into this new chapter of her life. But as he left the shelter, he made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't let her fade into the background. He would check in, be there when she needed support, and remind her that she wasn't alone. Over the next few weeks, Keanu visited Emily regularly. Sometimes he brought her coffee or books. Other times they simply sat together in the shelter's small courtyard, talking about everything and nothing. Emily began to open up slowly, sharing fragments of her past in between quiet moments. She spoke of a childhood marked by instability, of relationships that had left her scared, of dreams she had long buried beneath the weight of survival. But she also spoke of her love for art. How, as a child, she would spend hours sketching in old notebooks, losing herself in the colors and lines that felt like an escape from the chaos around her. Keanu encouraged her to revisit that passion, bringing her sketch pads and colored pencils, gently nudging her to find solace in the creativity she had once loved. At first, Emily was hesitant, unsure if she could still create after years of neglecting her talent. But with Keanu's unwavering support, she began to draw again. Her sketches were raw and emotional, reflecting the pain and resilience that defined her journey. Slowly, her art became a form of therapy, a way to process the past and envision a future. One afternoon, as they sat in the courtyard, Emily showed Keanu a drawing she had been working on, a portrait of a woman standing in the rain, her face turned toward the sky, eyes closed, as if embracing the storm. "This is beautiful," Keanu said, genuinely moved by the emotion captured in the lines and shading. "It's me," Emily whispered, her voice tinged with both pride and vulnerability. "But it's also every woman who's ever felt lost." Keanu nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "You've come a long way." Emily smiled softly, the first genuine smile he had seen from her. "I'm starting to believe I can keep going." In the weeks that followed, Emily's confidence grew. She began participating in the shelter's art therapy sessions, sharing her work with others, and finding a sense of community among women who understood her struggles. Keanu continued to be a steady presence in her life, but he also knew when to step back, allowing her to find her own strength. Their friendship deepened, built on mutual respect and understanding. Emily often marveled at how someone like Keanu, someone who had faced his own share of heartbreak and loss, could remain so kind and grounded. But Keanu would always shrug it off, insisting that kindness wasn't a choice for him, it was a way of life. Months passed, and Emily's transformation was nothing short of remarkable. She found a part-time job at a local art supply store, using her earnings to buy better materials for her work. She even submitted a few pieces to a community art show, where her talent was quickly recognized. Through it all, Keanu remained her biggest supporter, cheering her on from the sidelines. But it wasn't about the accolades or recognition. For both of them, it was about something much deeper, the quiet triumph of overcoming the odds, of finding light in the darkest places. One evening, as they walked through the city, Emily turned to Keanu, her eyes reflecting the glow of the streetlights. "You know," she said softly, "when I first met you, I thought you were my sign that things could get better." Keanu chuckled, a warm, genuine sound. "And now I know that I was the one who had to believe in it. But you helped me see it." Keanu placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his eyes filled with pride. "You did all the hard work, Emily. I just reminded you of what you already had inside." And in that moment, as they stood amidst the bustling city, Emily realized something profound. The journey wasn't just about surviving. It was about rediscovering the pieces of herself she thought were lost forever. And with Keanu by her side, she knew she would never lose her way again. The seasons began to shift, and with them, so did Emily's life. The chill of winter gave way to the tentative warmth of spring, and the once barren trees lining the city streets began to bloom, their branches heavy with the promise of new beginnings. For Emily, each day felt like peeling back layers of an old, suffocating life and stepping into something fragile yet exhilarating. But healing wasn't a straight path. It never was. The ghosts of her past still lingered in the corners of her mind, whispering doubts when she least expected them. And yet, every time those shadows crept in, Keanu was there, a steady presence reminding her that she wasn't walking this path alone. It was a late afternoon in early May when Keanu showed up at the art supply store, where Emily had been working part-time. The bell above the door chimed softly as he entered, and Emily, kneeling by a display of sketchbooks, looked up with a surprised smile. She still hadn't quite gotten used to the fact that Keanu Reeves, would casually drop by like any ordinary friend. But that's what he had become to her, a friend. Not a celebrity, not a distant figure from a screen, but someone who had walked into her life at her lowest and stayed. "Got a minute?" he asked, his eyes twinkling with a mischievous glint. Emily dusted off her hands and stood, brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "For you, always." Keanu pulled something from behind his back, a flyer slightly crumpled from being stuffed in his coat pocket. He handed it to her, and Emily's eyes scanned the bold, colorful text. "Community Art Gala, celebrating stories of resilience." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She'd heard about the gala. It was a big deal in their local community, a showcase of artists who used their work to tell powerful, personal stories. But it wasn't just any event. It was attended by influential figures, gallery owners, and people who could change an artist's life overnight. She felt her pulse quicken. "They're looking for submissions," Keanu said, his voice casual, but his eyes serious. "I think you should enter." Emily laughed nervously, shaking her head as she handed the flyer back. "Me? No way. That's for real artists. I'm not." Keanu cut her off with a look that silenced her protests. "Emily, you are a real artist. You've been through hell and turned it into something beautiful. That's exactly what this is about." She hesitated, the old doubts bubbling to the surface. What if she wasn't good enough? What if no one cared about her story? But then she looked at Keanu, at the unwavering belief in his eyes, and something inside her shifted. Maybe it was time to stop running from her fears. "Okay," she whispered, the word feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I'll do it." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Emily threw herself into her work with a passion she hadn't felt in years. She spent late nights at the shelter's art room, sketching, painting, and pouring her heart onto every canvas. Her art became a mirror of her journey, the pain, the loss, but also the hope and strength she'd found along the way. Keanu visited often, offering quiet encouragement, but he never interfered. He understood the sacredness of the creative process, how deeply personal it was. He would sit in the corner, sipping coffee, occasionally glancing up from a book to admire her work. And every time Emily felt the familiar creep of doubt, she'd catch his gaze and find the courage to keep going. The day of the gala arrived faster than Emily expected. She stood in front of the full-length mirror in her small room at the shelter, adjusting the simple but elegant dress Keanu had helped her pick out. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. There was still a hint of the girl who had stood in the rain that night, lost and broken. But now, there was something else, something stronger. She was no longer defined by her past. She was an artist, a survivor. When Keanu arrived to pick her up, his breath caught slightly as he saw her. "You look incredible," he said, and Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest. Coming from anyone else, the compliment might have felt superficial, but from Keanu, it was genuine, filled with the weight of everything they had been through together. The gala was held in a repurposed warehouse downtown, its industrial interior transformed into a vibrant gallery space. Strings of lights hung from the ceiling, casting a soft glow over the room, while the walls were adorned with artwork from dozens of local artists. The space buzzed with energy, laughter, conversation, and the occasional pop of champagne corks. Emily's work was displayed in a quiet corner of the gallery. She had submitted 3 pieces, each representing a different part of her journey. The first was a dark, chaotic swirl of colors, capturing the confusion and despair of her lowest moments. The second was more subdued, with soft lines and muted tones, reflecting the quiet resilience that had begun to take root. The third was her favorite, a vibrant, bold piece depicting a woman standing in the rain, her face lifted to the sky, eyes closed, as if embracing both the storm and the promise of sunlight beyond it. As people wandered through the gallery, Emily watched nervously from a distance, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw strangers stop in front of her work, tilting their heads thoughtfully, some even wiping away tears. It was surreal. For so long, her pain had felt like a burden she carried alone. But now, through her art, it connected her to others in a way she never imagined. Keanu stayed by her side, offering quiet reassurances. He introduced her to other artists, to gallery owners, and even to a journalist from a local magazine who was interested in doing a feature on her work. But what mattered most to Emily wasn't the recognition or the compliments. It was the feeling of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. As the evening wore on, the gala organizers announced the winners of the showcase, artists whose work had moved the judges the most. Emily didn't expect to hear her name. She was content just to be there, to share her story. But when they called her name as one of the featured artists of the night, she stood frozen in disbelief. Keanu nudged her gently. "That's you, Emily. Go." Her legs felt like jelly as she made her way to the front of the room, the applause ringing in her ears like a distant echo. When she reached the stage, she took the microphone with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the crowd before landing on Keanu. His smile grounded her, giving her the courage to speak. "I never thought I'd be standing here tonight," she began, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "A few months ago, I was lost. I didn't believe I had a future, let alone something worth sharing with the world. But someone reminded me that even in our darkest moments, there's a spark inside us that refuses to die. We just need someone to help us see it." She paused, her eyes glistening with tears. For me, that someone was Keanu. He didn't just give me his coat that night in the rain. He gave me hope. And tonight, I hope my story can do the same for someone else. The room erupted in applause, but Emily barely heard it. All she could see was Keanu, standing at the back of the room, his eyes shining with pride. In that moment, she realized that her journey wasn't just about survival. It was about transformation. She had taken the broken pieces of her past and turned them into something beautiful, something that could inspire others to do the same. After the gala, as they stepped out into the cool night air, Keanu turned to her with a smile. "I told you you were a real artist." Emily laughed, a sound full of light and freedom. "I guess I just needed someone to believe it first." Keanu slipped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her into a warm, brotherly hug. "You've got this, Emily. The world's just getting started with you." And as they walked down the street, the city lights twinkling above them, Emily felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare her. She was ready to face whatever came next, armed with the knowledge that even the smallest spark could light up the darkest night. And she knew, deep in her heart, that she would carry Keanu's kindness with her wherever she went. A reminder that sometimes the most unexpected encounters could change a life forever. The weeks following the gala felt like stepping into a dream Emily never dared to imagine. The recognition she received wasn't just fleeting applause or polite compliments. It was genuine interest in her story, her art, and most importantly, her journey. Invitations to exhibit her work started trickling in from local galleries, and a feature in a popular online magazine brought her story to a wider audience. People reached out to her, strangers who had seen a piece of themselves reflected in her art, people who had felt the same kind of darkness and were inspired by her emergence from it. For the first time in her life, Emily felt like her voice mattered. But with the new attention came new challenges. Fame, even on a small local scale, was overwhelming. The sudden influx of people praising her, asking for interviews, or requesting commissions stirred a new kind of anxiety in Emily. She wasn't sure how to navigate this world, one where her past was on display for everyone to see. The fear of being vulnerable, of letting people see the parts of her that were still healing, crept in at night when the excitement faded, leaving only the echoes of old doubts. Keanu noticed the shift in her immediately. They were sitting in their usual spot in the shelter's courtyard, the same place where Emily had first dared to believe in herself. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground as a gentle breeze rustled the trees. Emily was quieter than usual, her sketchbook resting on her lap, untouched. "You've hardly drawn anything," Keanu remarked softly, his eyes studying her face. Emily sighed, closing the sketchbook with a soft thud. "I don't know. I just feel like, what if I'd already peaked? What if this is it? What if people find out I'm not as strong as they think?" Keanu leaned back in his chair, letting her words settle in the space between them. He understood that fear all too well. The pressure of living up to expectations, of feeling like you had to maintain an image even when you were struggling underneath. "Emily," he said after a moment, his voice steady and calm, "your strength isn't in being perfect, it's in being real. People don't connect with you because they think you have it all figured out. They connect because you've shown them it's okay to not have all the answers." Emily looked at him, her eyes searching his face for reassurance. "But what if I let them down?" Keanu smiled gently, the kind of smile that spoke of years of wisdom earned through his own trials. "You won't, because you're not here to live up to anyone else's expectations. You're here to live your truth, and if that truth means having hard days, then that's okay." His words settled into her like a soothing balm. She realized that the fear wasn't about failing. It was about being seen, fully and completely, without the mask she had grown used to wearing. But Keanu's unwavering support reminded her that it was okay to be seen, even in her most vulnerable moments. A week later, Emily received an invitation that would push her even further out of her comfort zone. A prestigious art gallery downtown, known for showcasing emerging artists with powerful stories, wanted to host a solo exhibit of her work. It was an opportunity she couldn't have dreamed of months ago. But now that it was real, the magnitude of it was both exhilarating and terrifying. She met Keanu at their favorite cafe to share the news. As soon as he walked through the door, she waved him over, her eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and fear. "You won't believe this," she said, sliding the invitation across the table to him. Keanu picked it up, reading the elegant script before looking back at her with a grin. "Emily, this is incredible." She bit her lip, her fingers nervously tapping the edge of her coffee cup. "It is, but what if I'm not ready for this? A solo exhibit? That's huge." Keanu set the invitation down and reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. "You're more ready than you think, and you're not doing this alone. I'll be there every step of the way." His words anchored her, giving her the courage to say yes to the opportunity. Over the next few weeks, Emily poured herself into her work, creating new pieces that delved even deeper into her journey. She explored themes of resilience, hope, and the beauty found in imperfection. Her art became bolder, more confident, reflecting not just where she had been, but where she was going. Keanu continued to be her steadfast supporter, helping her set up the exhibit, offering feedback when she asked for it, and reminding her to take breaks when the pressure became too much. Their bond deepened, not just as friends, but as kindred spirits who understood the power of perseverance and the importance of compassion. The night of the exhibit arrived, and Emily stood in the center of the gallery, surrounded by her work. The space was filled with people, friends from the shelter, local artists, and even a few critics who had heard about her story. But the only person she searched for in the crowd was Keanu. When she spotted him near the entrance, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on hers, she felt a wave of calm wash over her. He made his way through the crowd, stopping occasionally to admire her work, before finally standing beside her. "Nervous?" he asked, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "Terrified," she admitted, but there was a smile on her face, one that spoke of pride and accomplishment. "You've got this," Keanu said, his eyes filled with unwavering belief. "You've already won by being here." Emily nodded, taking a deep breath as she turned to face the crowd. The gallery owner introduced her, and as the applause died down, Emily stepped forward to speak. "I used to believe that my story ended the night I stood in the rain, feeling like there was no way forward," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her chest. "But someone once told me that even in our darkest moments, there's a spark inside us that refuses to die. That spark led me here tonight." She paused, her eyes finding Keanu's in the crowd. "And I owe so much of that to a friend who showed me that kindness can change everything. Keanu, thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." The room filled with applause once more. But for Emily, the only thing that mattered was the warmth in Keanu's eyes, the silent understanding that passed between them. This wasn't just her victory, it was theirs. After the exhibit, as they walked through the quiet streets of the city, Emily felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The future still held uncertainties, but she no longer feared them. She had faced the storm and found her strength in its aftermath. "You know," she said, glancing at Keanu, "I used to think you were my sign that things could get better. But now I realize you were the spark. I had to believe in myself, but you lit the way." Keanu smiled, his arm wrapping around her shoulders in a gesture of quiet solidarity. "And now you're the spark for others." As they continued down the street, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement, Emily knew that her story was far from over. But whatever came next, she was ready, because she had learned that even in the darkest of nights, a single spark could ignite a flame bright enough to guide the way forward. And with Keanu by her side, she would carry that light into the future, illuminating the path not just for herself, but for everyone who needed to find their own way out of the darkness. The months following Emily's solo exhibit were a whirlwind of opportunities and challenges that she had never imagined facing. Her name became known in the local art scene, and her story resonated far beyond the confines of the gallery walls. Invitations poured in from other cities, asking her to showcase her work, speak about her journey, and lead workshops for aspiring artists who were struggling with their own battles. But with this newfound recognition came an unexpected weight. The more people celebrated her resilience, the more Emily felt the pressure to maintain the image of someone who had conquered her past. Yet, deep down, she knew healing wasn't a linear process. There were still days when the shadows crept in, when self-doubt whispered in her ear, and when she wondered if she truly deserved all the praise. One evening, after returning from an out-of-town exhibit in Boston, Emily found herself sitting alone in her small apartment, the one she had moved into after finally leaving the shelter. The walls were adorned with her artwork, each piece a testament to her journey. But tonight, they felt like silent witnesses to her growing uncertainty. The city buzzed outside her window, its lights flickering like distant stars. But inside, Emily felt isolated in a way she hadn't felt in months. Without thinking, she reached for her phone and sent a simple message. "Can we talk?" It didn't take long for Keanu to reply. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. True to his word, Keanu arrived at her doorstep, his familiar, calming presence filling the room the moment she let him in. He didn't ask any questions right away. Instead, he settled into the old armchair by her window, giving her space to find the words she needed. Emily sat across from him, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. She stared at the floor, struggling to articulate the tangled mess of emotions swirling inside her. Finally, she looked up, her eyes meeting his with a vulnerability she hadn't shown in a long time. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. Keanu tilted his head slightly, his expression soft and patient. "Do what?" "Be this person, the one everyone thinks is so strong, so put together. They look at me like I've figured it all out, like I'm some kind of inspiration. But I haven't. I still wake up some days feeling like I'm back where I started." Keanu nodded, his gaze steady and understanding. He let her words hang in the air for a moment before responding. "You're not alone in feeling that way, Emily. People see the art, the success, but they don't see the struggles that come with it. The pressure, the doubts. That's part of the journey too." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "But what if I'm not enough? What if they find out I'm just pretending?" Keanu leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "You're not pretending. You're living. And living means facing ups and downs. It's not about having all the answers. It's about showing up, even when it's hard. That's what makes you strong, Emily. Not being perfect, but being real." The weight of his words settled into her heart, easing some of the tension she had been carrying. She took a deep breath, feeling the tightness in her chest begin to loosen. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Keanu smiled, his eyes warm with affection. "You'd be just fine. But I'm glad I can be here." That night, they sat together in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from a deep, unspoken understanding. Keanu's presence reminded Emily that she didn't have to carry everything alone. She could be vulnerable, she could struggle, and she could still be the strong, resilient person others saw in her. In the weeks that followed, Emily began to embrace the idea that strength didn't mean the absence of fear or doubt. It meant facing those feelings head-on and continuing forward anyway. She started sharing more of her struggles openly, both in her art and in the talks she gave. She spoke about the ongoing nature of healing, the reality of bad days, and the importance of leaning on others when the weight became too much to bear. Her honesty resonated even more deeply with people. They saw not just an artist who had overcome her past, but a human being who was navigating life's complexities with courage and authenticity. Emily's workshops became a safe space for others to share their own stories, and her art continued to inspire those who felt lost in their own journeys. One day, while preparing for a new exhibit titled The Unfinished Journey, Emily received a letter that stopped her in her tracks. It was from a young woman named Mia, who had attended one of her workshops months earlier. "Dear Emily, I wanted to thank you for sharing your story. I was in a dark place when I first heard you speak, convinced that there was no way out of the pain I was feeling. But seeing you stand there, unapologetically yourself, gave me hope. You didn't just inspire me, you saved me. I'm now pursuing my own passion for photography, and I finally believe that my story matters too. Thank you for being the spark I needed." Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she read the letter. It was a reminder that her journey, with all its ups and downs, had a ripple effect far beyond what she could see. She realized that every step she took, no matter how small, had the power to inspire someone else to take their own. That evening, she met Keanu at the same cafe where they had shared countless conversations over the past year. She handed him the letter, her heart swelling with gratitude as he read it. "She's just one of many, Emily," Keanu said, looking up from the letter. "You're changing lives in ways you can't even imagine." Emily smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "I guess I finally believe it." They sat there, sipping their coffee, the weight of their shared journey settling between them like an old, comfortable blanket. They had both faced their own storms, but they had also found light in each other, a testament to the power of connection, compassion, and the simple act of showing up. As they left the cafe, walking side by side through the bustling city streets, Emily felt a profound sense of peace. Her journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more doubts, but she knew she had the strength to face whatever came next. She had found her voice, her purpose, and a friendship that had transformed her life in ways she could never have anticipated. And as they disappeared into the night, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement, Emily knew that no matter where life took her, she would carry Keanu's kindness with her always, a beacon of hope, and a reminder that even in the darkest of times, a single spark could light the way forward. A year had passed since the night Emily stood in the rain, lost and on the verge of giving up. A year since she had whispered those 3 words to Keanu Reeves. "You came back," and unknowingly set in motion a journey that would not only change her life, but ripple out to touch countless others. The city, ever restless and vibrant, had transformed alongside her, and with every season that passed, Emily found herself growing in ways she had never thought possible. Her latest project, the Whisper Project, was more than just an art initiative. It was a movement. What had started as a small collection of personal pieces had blossomed into a full-fledged community art center dedicated to helping people channel their struggles into creativity. The center welcomed everyone: survivors of abuse, individuals battling mental health issues, those grappling with grief, and even people simply seeking connection in a world that often felt too overwhelming. The walls were covered in raw, emotional works of art, each piece telling a story of resilience, hope, and the power of human connection. The grand opening of the Whisper Project was set for tonight. Emily had spent weeks preparing, pouring her heart into every detail, making sure the space felt welcoming, safe, and inspiring. As she walked through the brightly lit rooms, making last-minute adjustments to the displays, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the journey that had brought her here. Every stroke of paint, every tear shed over a canvas, every late-night conversation with Keanu, it all led to this moment. Speaking of Keanu, he was nowhere to be seen yet, but Emily wasn't worried. He had promised he'd be there. And if there was one thing she had learned about Keanu Reeves, it was that he always kept his promises. Still, a part of her felt the familiar flutter of nerves. This wasn't just any event. It was a culmination of everything they had built together, even if his name wasn't on the sign outside. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, people began to trickle in. The air buzzed with excitement and anticipation. Friends from the shelter, fellow artists, community leaders, and even some local journalists had come to see what Emily had created. The room filled with laughter and conversation, the sounds blending with the soft music playing in the background. But Emily's eyes kept drifting toward the door. Then, just as the clock struck 7, he appeared. Keanu walked in quietly, as he always did, blending into the crowd despite being a face recognized by millions. But to Emily, he was more than just a celebrity. He was the man who had changed the course of her life with a simple act of kindness. Their eyes met across the room, and Emily felt a rush of emotion swell in her chest. She made her way through the crowd, weaving between guests, until she stood in front of him. "You made it," she said, her voice soft but steady. Keanu smiled, that familiar warmth in his eyes. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." For a moment, they just stood there, the noise of the crowd fading into the background. Emily felt the weight of everything they had been through, the highs and lows, the victories and setbacks. And now, here they were, standing in the middle of a dream brought to life. As the evening progressed, Emily found herself surrounded by people eager to hear her story. She spoke openly about her journey, about the night she met Keanu, and how that simple encounter had been the catalyst for everything that followed. But she made sure to emphasize one important point. This wasn't just her story. It was a story about the power of kindness, about how one small act could set off a chain reaction that changed lives. At one point during the night, the crowd gathered for Emily's official speech. She stood at the front of the room, her heart pounding in her chest as she looked out at the faces before her. And there, near the back of the room, stood Keanu, his quiet presence grounding her as it always did. She took a deep breath and began. A little over a year ago, I was standing in the rain, convinced that my life had no purpose. I felt invisible, hopeless, and ready to give up. But then, someone saw me, not because I asked for help, and not because I was anyone special. He saw me simply because he cared. That moment changed everything. She paused, letting the words sink in. I stand here tonight because one person chose kindness, and that kindness gave me the strength to believe in myself, to find my voice, and to build something that could help others do the same. The Whisper Project isn't just about art. It's about the stories we all carry, the struggles we face, and the hope we can find when we realize we're not alone. Her eyes found Keanu's once more, and she felt her voice catch with emotion. Keanu, you didn't just give me your coat that night. You gave me a future. And for that, I will always be grateful. The room erupted in applause, but Emily barely heard it. She was focused on the quiet nod Keanu gave her, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. After the speech, people mingled, admiring the artwork and sharing their own stories of resilience. Emily felt a sense of fulfillment she had never known before, not just because of the success of the event, but because of the connections being made all around her. Later in the evening, as the crowd began to thin and the buzz of conversation settled into a quiet hum, Emily found Keanu standing near one of her favorite pieces, a painting of a woman standing in the rain, her face turned toward the sky, embracing both the storm and the light breaking through the clouds. I still remember that night like it was yesterday, Emily said, joining him. Keanu chuckled softly. So do I, but look at you now. Emily smiled, her eyes misting with tears. I wouldn't be here without you. Keanu shook his head gently. You give me too much credit. I was just a guy who happened to be in the right place at the right time. You did the hard work. Emily reached out, squeezing his hand. Maybe. But sometimes, all it takes is one person to believe in you, when you can't believe in yourself. They stood there in silence for a while, taking in the art, the people, and the journey that had brought them to this point. The city lights flickered outside the windows, casting a soft glow over the room. It felt like the end of a chapter, but also the beginning of something new. As the night came to a close, Keanu turned to Emily, his expression thoughtful. You know, he said, I think you've started something bigger than either of us could have imagined. Emily nodded, her heart full. And it's only just beginning. They hugged, a deep, heartfelt embrace that spoke of gratitude, friendship, and the unbreakable bond they had formed. As Keanu left the gallery, disappearing into the night like he had so many times before, Emily watched him go with a sense of peace. She knew their paths would cross again. But even if they didn't, his impact on her life was indelible. Standing in the center of the Whisper Project, surrounded by the art and stories of people who had found hope through her journey, Emily realized something profound. Life wasn't about avoiding the storms. It was about learning to dance in the rain, to find beauty in the chaos, and to hold on to the people who help us see the light when all we can see is darkness. And for Emily, that light had come in the form of a man who had offered her his coat on a rainy night in New York City, a simple act of kindness that had set her free.